these closing weeks of the campaign, the economy isn't the topic. And so what you're seeing are two very separate narratives. The narrative on the right tends to be focused on immigration, which is a low confidence topic. We're afraid of things that are different when confidence is low. And yet, at the same time, Kamala Harris's closing argument is largely around the issue of women's rights. And so she's appealing to the vulnerability of women and men around women's right to choose. And so you have both candidates choosing topics of vulnerability, which is unusual to see left and right going at fear in a moment like this.
Hello and welcome to the Achieving Alpha podcast. My name is Stephen and I'm the host of the show. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Atwater. He is the author of the book, The Confidence Map, Charting a Path from Chaos to Clarity. He is also the adjunct professor at the University of Delaware. Welcome to the podcast, Peter. Really great to have you on. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Stephen. Thank you.
So I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. I think we'll delve into a lots of different areas around confidence, and we can also go more into the psychology of the markets. So really looking forward to that today. So as it's your first time on the podcast, I wanted to ask you to provide a background into your experience in investing and a little bit more about your career.
Sure. So I actually have two careers. I have a very classic finance career, started with JPMorgan right out of college, ended up helping to build and then run their asset-backed securities business, uh, packaging up credit card loans and car loans. And then I went to work for one of my clients, First USA, which was at that point a credit card issuer. We got bought by Bank One, and I ended up working as the treasurer there, and then the head of the asset management business, and then ultimately going back to work with some of my friends from First USA in a company called Juniper that ultimately is now Barclays US credit card operation. When I turned 45, my son said, "Dad, you're halfway to 90." And that was my midlife crisis. And so I ended up leaving financial services in 2006. And just as the housing bubble was really coming to a crest, and I ended up spending the financial crisis advising some money managers and hedge funds to help them navigate it, because I had a lot of background in securitization, understood how regulators think, the rating agencies, and all of that. But that really led me sort of down a rabbit hole to think about, why did investors get overly excited about the housing market and mortgages? And more importantly, what happened at the bottom? Because in March 2009, everybody thought things were only going to get worse, and then they didn't. And so that sort of led me to wonder, what happens at extremes in confidence? How can I learn from that to help investors? And ultimately, that led me into a broader analysis of confidence and its impact on what we do.
So what motivated you to write the book then?
What motivated me is that I've been teaching this class on confidence and decision making for almost a decade now. And what I found with my students was that I thought I was teaching a class on really the impact of collective confidence, or the crowd's behavior in decision making. And what they told me was that the class had had a powerful impact on their own decision making, that they were applying the concepts from my class to their own lives. And so that led me to think that there's more people could benefit from what I was teaching.
Yeah. It's a really fascinating book. It goes into so many different topics. So, congratulations on writing that. I would suggest everybody reads it as part of the investor education. But I wanted to ask you about kind of the key theme of your book, which is obviously confidence. And a lot of that confidence comes around four different quadrants. Can you just explain that to the audience who may not have read your book yet and just explain and also explain your definition of confidence in your pretext?
Yeah, so one of the things that I discovered early on in my class, I'm asking my students, what is confidence? And I realized as they were struggling to answer the question that I wasn't sure I could answer it either. And so I had to spend some time to think about what is it that leads us to feel confidence. And where I came down was that we needed two things. We needed to feel that things were certain, that there was an element of predictability to what was ahead, but that wasn't enough. We also needed to have a sense of control. And the way you could think about that is it's great if I know the road ahead is straight, but if I don't know how to drive the car, I'm not going to feel confident behind the wheel. And so we need both certainty and control. That then led me to think about how do changes in those levels of certainty and control begin to tie to what we want and what we do. And so I came up with what I call the confidence quadrant, which takes certainty and puts it along the x-axis, takes control and puts that on the y-axis, but creates then four separate areas, environments, as it were, where we have you know a combination of high confidence and high control. I call that the comfort zone. I put that in the upper right hand corner. And that's where things feel relaxed. It's easy. Things make sense to us. The opposite of that, where we have little certainty and little control, I call the stress center in the lower left hand corner. And there is where we generally feel a lot of anxiety. You know, anxiety is a natural physiological and emotional response to when we lack certainty and control in our lives. And initially, it was those two boxes that I thought was where we spent most of our life. But then I started to have to think about okay, are there environments where we have either certainty or control? And I concluded not only that we do, but those are where we spend a lot of our lives. So, where we have certainty but no control, I call the passenger seat. It's what we experience on an airplane or when we're in the not in the driver's seat of a car. But what's so fascinating about that space, that lower right-hand box, is that as a means to an end, we'll tolerate it. But if we're stuck there, then it starts to feel like a prison. In fact, the lower right-hand corner of that box would define a maximum security prison where you have absolutely 100% certainty but are completely powerless. It's an abusive relationship. There are a lot of interesting experiences that happen in that box. But the box that I think is most relevant to investors is the upper left-hand box where we have control but no certainty. And I call that the launch pad. It's where we make a decision today having no idea what the outcome is going to be. And at its core, that's where all investment decisions get made. But what we don't realize is that all investment decisions are driven by our imagination of the outcome. And so if I think I'm going to be successful, I'll buy. If I think it's going to be bad, I'm going to sell. But it's all predicated on our imagination. And what we fail to appreciate is that our imagination is entirely a reflection of how we feel. We mirror our mood in our outlook on what's ahead.
Yeah. It's actually quite interesting because I was thinking about this earlier when I was preparing for this interview. It's at all stages we experience different levels of that quadrant. It's not like sometimes people are extremely confident and they're confident all the time, right? There's within our lives so many things happen that put us out of control, or sometimes we feel confident, sometimes we want to come back into our comfort zone. How do you ensure that people are comfortable in all areas of the quadrant?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest disservices a lot of self-help experts provide is that they tell people, once you have confidence, you will always have confidence. And that's crap. Real life moves us around. And I define resilience as our ability to successfully move around the quadrant and are comfortable no matter where we land. That we know that when we're in the stress center, it's just going to be for now. We are rarely, if ever, in the stress center forever. And so it's gaining an appreciation for where we are and realizing that there are both strengths and weaknesses to each of the boxes. To me, there's no good or bad box. One is more relaxing, one is more stressful, but there are good things that come from the stress center, but we overlook them in those moments.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think we do need a bit of stress in our lives, and but also the other way, right, as well, right? Some people spend too much time in the comfort zone and they don't achieve things, or they don't manage to increase their skills, etc. So yeah, how do you go about preparing yourself for all of those different areas?
So I anticipate, to your point, that any given day can put me in a different box. And so often in the morning I will just map, where am I today and why? If the car's having trouble, if I've had a fight with my wife, or there's something going on with my kids, I can pretty well mark where I am. And then I'll pause to say, okay, if I feel like I'm in the stress center, I am going to be impatient. I'm going to be focused on myself and not necessarily others. And so I just sort of take a breath and remind myself, okay, this isn't forever. The car will get fixed. My wife and I will, so, but but appreciating that how I'm seeing the world is entirely related to my location, that my feelings, my stories, and my actions all exist in equilibrium, and they're a function of my location.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that does make a lot of sense. And do you see a lot of differences in terms of confidence, in terms of the different generations of cohorts?
I do. I see it particularly with this post 9/11 generation. One of the things, a long time ago, one of my students did a paper on parenting styles and mood. And if you go back to, say, the 1950s, and kids being, kicked out of the house in the morning, mom and dad would say, go play and come back at dinner time. Those kids grew up in the launch pad. They grew up learning how to navigate uncertainty and making small mistakes or making large mistakes, but living with the consequences. The post 9/11 generation, their parents' mantra was, I need to keep my kids safe. And so this is a generation that has largely grown up in the passenger seat. They have not had to experience the struggles of the launch pad, because those might introduce uncertainty, danger. So parents kept their kids out of that space. And so this is a generation that in many ways doesn't know how to take initiative, is very anxious about being entrepreneurs. They're wonderful followers, but they're very uncomfortable leading change.
I can see that. There definitely is some people being uncomfortable to do the change. Yeah. The other question, which is just a slight variation of the last question, do you see a difference in terms of culture and confidence? So we just talked about the different generations, but in terms of culture, do you see different confidence paths?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I can look at the Wall Street culture, which is very much a launchpad mindset. It's all about risk taking. When I talk to entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial culture, I've all but had tomatoes thrown at me when I've suggested that people like the comfort zone. To them, it's way too boring. It's not exciting. To them, uncertainty equals possibility, and that's what distinguishes, in my mind, the difference between entrepreneurs and everybody else, is that shift in the narrative that uncertainty equals possibility, and give them the steering wheel. They will happily drive the car until they figure it out. There are cultural differences. If we go around the globe of cultures that are more follower than leaders, I think you know we tend to stereotype Americans as entrepreneurs, and that engine of capitalism, being more comfortable in the launch pad. And then there are many other cultures that we would stereotype as more followers of an authoritarian figure.
Okay, and how has technology, so we talk about social media, how has that changed the dynamics of confidence?
So that's a really interesting question. I think initially what social media did, and the internet, when confidence was very high, we tend to reach out far into abstraction, so that every stranger feels familiar. And so what it created were a lot of these virtual relationships. And yet in-person relationships fell off the map. And what we find is that if I look at the 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 networks that particularly this younger generation has, they're heavily populated by individuals that are psychologically distant versus physically present. And so if you think about, in a crisis, what you need most are those who are physically present. And in this generation, they're the ones that are most lacking. And and I often will say to my students, in a crisis, nobody from the internet is going to show up at your door. It's those shared physical relationships that create cohesion when confidence is low. And so we need to encourage people to establish these close, intimate relationships in the physical world more than in the virtual world. Because when confidence is low, that's when they matter most.
Yeah, that's absolutely true because you see a lot of younger generations, they look out for influencers or people where they feel have some wisdom to impart. But it's very hard to get tailored information that's specific for your situation, like you would get from a friend or you'd get from a professor or someone that you were fairly close to. So I think you get this kind of new generation of people that are idol worshipping people that they see on YouTube or they see on television. It's quite dangerous.
Yeah, and it's much easier for me to be a fraud when we don't interact with each other every day, where you don't really know me. And so we have to be really careful about the degree to which we trust all of these individuals on those far extremes in our lives.
Yeah. Okay, I wanted to skip on now to talk a bit more about markets. How do you assess the overall market at the moment and the economy in terms of confidence?
So if I look at the US market, which I do a lot, confidence is extremely high. We're recording this a week before the US presidential election, and investors have basically announced that no matter the winner, they will win. So there's a great deal of bullishness. If Trump were to win, we have this narrative around the Trump trade. Things are going to be even better. But there's no sense that the election ahead could create uncertainty. That and so I think this is a case where investors are making decisions, bringing their prior experiences with them, and have now concluded that American politics doesn't matter. We'll see. But elsewhere, I mean, we can go to the other extreme, and certainly as recently as the summer, there was incredible hopelessness in the markets in China. This sense that you had garbage time, you had this real you know sense of powerlessness and uncertainty, and it's only with the government taking aggressive actions to push the market higher that we've seen any real interest in that market. But even so, there's a great deal of tentativeness. People are very uncertain that these steps that the government are taking may be sufficient.
Yeah, we're waiting for more and more stimulus to be pumped in, but I guess what is enough? And that will drive how confident people are in the economy of China.
Well, and at the bottom, people don't believe anything will be enough. The doom loop can't be stopped.
So on the US election, obviously it's coming up very soon. I think you just alluded to as well that the fact that Kamala Harris is a known quantity because she's the current vice president of the US, and she's going to follow quite similar policies, I think, to Joe Biden before. And also Donald Trump has been president before, so I think a lot of people know what his policies are going to look like to a degree. Do you think the fact that there is certainty in budget is really going to help investor confidence moving forward into the next few months?
It's tempting to say that, but what I see is slightly different. I think investors have intense certainty in Donald Trump. They know who he is, they know what he's been, they associate him with capitalism and deregulation. And so they view his presidency as one in which the White House will do whatever it takes to keep the market going. So there's a very bullish narrative around him. What's interesting to me is that Kamala Harris is still a much more abstract figure. She's an unknown. Yes, she's a Democrat, but she doesn't there on both sides of the aisle, people are having a more difficult time saying Kamala Harris equals this. And so that level of abstraction, I think, hurts her in the general election. It suggests to me that in order to vote for her, you need to be a higher confident voter. So rising confidence favors her, excuse me, falling confidence favors him. But it's going to be, I I think that investors may have overestimated the certainty with either candidate. As I said, I think she is more unknown, and I think she could surprise investors. I think that at the same time, Trump the Trump trade may be overbelieved at this point. One of the things, and the reason I offer all of this is that if I look at where Washington is united, it is in greater control, greater regulation of big tech. The left and the right both are concerned about the level of power evident in big tech today. And as big tech has been the driver of a lot of the growth in the market, I think there's a potential that whether you're a Republican or Democrat investor, you ultimately get surprised by mood driving greater regulation in the market.
Mm. And I've heard you say before as well elsewhere where you've mentioned about how the confidence in the economy at that given time is a good indicator of who could potentially win elections, because I guess it's that someone having policies but being there at the right time or being elected at the right time. Do you get any, not judgments about who's going to win, but from the actual economy right now, how do you think the confidence of the economy will play out on who could potentially win this election?
Yeah, on objective measures, unemployment, current inflation levels, all of those should favor the incumbent party. That measured objectively, things are good. Therefore, we as voters would want that to continue, which again favors the incumbent. What is so interesting is that we are too close to a time period where inflation felt high, unemployment seemed at risk because of the pandemic. And so the economy isn't the tailwind that you would normally associate with just based on its current metrics. Now, having said that, what is fascinating is in these closing weeks of the campaign, the economy isn't the topic. And so what you're seeing are two very separate narratives. The narrative on the right tends to be focused on immigration, which is a low confidence topic. We're afraid of things that are different, that are outside when confidence is low. And yet, at the same time, Kamala Harris's closing argument is largely around the issue of women's rights. And so she's appealing to the vulnerability of women and men around women's right to choose. And so you have both candidates choosing topics of vulnerability, which is unusual to see left and right going at fear in a moment like this.
Why do you think that they're going after the vulnerability rather than kind of pressing on the economy? Is there something that's happening in the psyche of people around the world right now that is influencing that they should appeal to vulnerability over economic expansion?
Yeah, I think that I guess to preface this first, appreciate that vulnerability is the opposite of confidence. When I feel vulnerable, there's a sense of uncertainty and powerless. If I've experienced a traumatic event, trauma is those two in extreme. I think you've got COVID, the still the lingering sense of uncertainty and powerlessness with that. We've been through a period of high inflation. We have lots of geopolitical risk, particularly in the Middle East. We've had issues of vulnerability arising from the Supreme Court. And so what I sense is a, a high degree of what I call stacked vulnerability, where people feel powerless and uncertain today in multiple dimensions, and they're adding up. And you can overlay uncertainty and powerlessness at work, in your personal life. And so there's a sense of scarcity. People are looking for that candidate who addresses the vulnerability that matters most to me. And for some, that vulnerability feels like immigration. For others, it feels like women's reproductive rights. For others, it's inflation. But what you find is that when mood is low, my vulnerability is specific to me. We don't have, there's really no shared vulnerability. It's the one that really is triggering for me, that is going to drive me to pick a particular candidate.
Yeah, I suppose especially for single issue voters as well, rather than people who have specifically always been one party.
And when confidence is low, we tend to be single issue oriented. It's the issue that matters most to me today. We're very much me here now. It's an individual determination.
Is that because of our survival instincts?
Yes.
Because it's the first thing that you think about, right? You've got to protect yourself before thinking about the greater good or the larger population.
Yeah, I'm worried about the bear outside my tent, whatever that bear is, as I define it.
That makes total sense. Okay, and what are some of the most overlooked signals that people don't think about which demonstrate confidence in the markets? Which are the things that people don't think about but are things that they should consider?
I love headlines. I think nothing is better than headlines and the imagery that photo editors put around headlines that offer these wonderful clues in terms of where we are in a confidence cycle. If there's one word that grabs my attention, it's the word unstoppable. And at both extremes in the market, that word shows up. The decline is unstoppable. It's only going to get worse. At the top, it's unstoppable. It's only going higher. And there's a sense of power, pent up energy that is captured in that word and words like it that are offering clues that the trajectory from here is absolutely certain. I'm seeing it today in gold. I'm seeing it today in Bitcoin, where no matter what happens after the election, it's only going up. And that could be the case, but then I look at price to see, does price reflect that? You know, is the crowd acting on that story? Again, this need for equilibrium between how we feel, the stories we tell, and the actions, ergo the price of something in the markets. So I love, I will read the paper in the morning to see what is news, what is prominent at the top of a website, on the front page of a cover, because though that placement is telling me what's important to the editors, which means it's important to the reader. And that placement is giving me clues in terms of what matters and where we are in the cycle. I love to see a story go from, page C12 to B4 to A1, because I can see the migration. Okay, now it's front and center.
Yeah, that's really interesting because actually, what we usually see is, for example, when they do the Forbes Man of the Year or Person of the Year, that usually marks the top of their success, or or they're just about to do something really bad, right? So I remember Elon Musk got it. I think was in 2021. I think after the pandemic, and then I think Sam Bankman-Fried was one of the people who was on it just before his demise and he's sent to jail. So that's quite an interesting indicator, isn't it?
Oh yeah, deification is the kiss of death. You are the next Warren Buffett. You are the next Einstein. I tell my students, you don't want to be on the cover of a magazine. That if you're running a business, that's the time you hang up your skates and you sell the business and go off on vacation. And I would say, Elon Musk, not just on the cover of Time magazine, but on Saturday Night Live. So he had become this true cultural symbol that he was part of the zeitgeist. And I'd offer today he is similarly at risk. He is so front and center in so many dimensions today that I can't help but question, is he overexposed, and does he now feel a level of invulnerability that naturally precedes a dramatic decline in confidence? Don't wish it, but
Yeah, I know what you mean because the more successful you are in different aspects, and the more of a like a monopoly you build up in the companies that you're building, the more exposure you have to governments. Especially now, he's very much focusing on the President Trump campaign, which again, if Kamala Harris comes in, it could put him in a bit of a sticky position, right?
and even if Trump wins, I mean, one of the things we've seen over and over during the first administration is that the former president he doesn't take fondly to others getting the spotlight.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and on the subject that we were just mentioned briefly before, we were talking about bubbles in the market, and we were talking about high prices in the market on certain sectors. How do bubbles form in terms of confidence? How does confidence rise, and how does it get to bubble status in terms of confidence?
Well, I think one thing today is it happens far faster than it ever has in history. I mean, if you think about the meme stock phenomenon, these are micro bubbles, and what they have is intense energy that is released simultaneously by the crowd in this frantic buying behavior, and driven entirely by narrative, as it always is. But what you see is it becomes self-fueling, that there nothing draws a crowd like a vertical line in the markets. And so you'll often see with these bubbles what I think of as archipelago patterns, where there are visible and sizable gaps on a daily chart, where investors are so eager to get in that they don't care about yesterday's price. It's all about where today's price is going to go. And it's not about absolute value. It's literally about the potential to make money from here. So there's a complete disregard for valuation. It's true speculation that I'm betting that price will go higher. And speculation is one of those behaviors that we only see at the extreme. If you think about bidding wars, it's another term that I love to hear, because a bidding war says to me, okay, we're at an extreme in confidence. Buyers think there's scarcity. They are worried about being left out. They have to get in. A bidding war is, FOMO at its very best.
And I guess VCs as well, when the VC sector really hots up and everybody's trying to get into any small company that they can, I guess that's a sign of extreme high confidence too, right?
Yeah, and what you also see is sort of this peer pressure. If I were to look today, I think there's an amusing level of peer pressure among billionaires. You are not you have no street cred unless you own two or three different sports teams.
Yeah, I guess that's just a way of showing your status, right? Because you've got money and you've got power. What's the next thing? You want to own things that people kind of rally towards, right? So sports is one of those things.
Yeah, it's the Rolex watch of this generation.
Yeah, yeah. It's quite interesting. I wanted to talk about AI because a lot of people say it could potentially be in a bubble or it could be quite frothy at the moment. Um, but I've got some quite interesting observations about it as well. Because what I usually find in these kind of bubbles is you usually have very small companies that come out of nowhere, right? So you have these new companies that come out and they probably only have a white paper to say what they do, and they haven't turned any profitability or anything. But what I find quite interesting about the AI at the moment is it tends to be focused around the very large companies. Is that anything to do with people's confidence levels in the technology?
Yeah, well, just more broadly, I wrote a piece for the Financial Times last summer on this topic because, to your point, if we go back to 2021, we had this frenzy in abstraction. You had, to your point, people coming out of the woodwork with EV companies. You had and fraudulent EV companies, Lordstown Motors and others that were complete shams. But it was coincidental with all of these shammy cryptocurrencies. We even had the term shit coins. People, just openly talking about them that way. You had SPACs. You had this cluster in abstraction. Everything was a dream. The AI bubble, to your point, has been very different. We've been betting on the sure things, the biggest in tech. And that to me says that this cycle is a more conservative frenzy than the one we saw in 2021. In fact, I would, if you go back and measure it in terms of real terms, the Dow Gold ratio, you really see this that peak in confidence was much greater than what we've been experiencing since. And the danger to me in that is investors are exhibiting a level of selection that cautions that moving forward, they're only likely to become even more selective. That we're going to just keep migrating to lesser and lesser risk taking ahead. And that's not what you want when you're thinking about this being the beginning of a longer bull market.
Yeah. I'm just wondering whether it might just be the stage of the bubble that we might be in, where later on, as the technology kind of spreads around to other companies and people get more capabilities in AI, whether that will then spread out to smaller companies who have big dreams of expanding their companies. And then we might see higher risk taking behavior taking place as we kind of go up in the risk cycle. What do you think?
I mean, I often use the small cap index as a reasonable barometer of risk taking more broadly. How does the crowd feel? Well, the crowd is going to reflect that most in small caps because, to your point, if we're feeling more confident, we're more likely to invest in things that are smaller, more risky startups, versus the mega caps. And there are a lot of people who believe that what we're going to see is a large pivot away from the Mag 7 into small caps. And I'm sort of watching to see does that actually manifest.
I guess that will be a sign of increased confidence in the sector. The more it flows into small caps and the more liquidity is in the market, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to mention about misplaced confidence because I think there's a lot of things where people are very confident about specific things, which I think can be dangerous, especially for economic stability. What's your thoughts on misplaced confidence?
I would frame it in misimagination, that we misimagine what is ahead routinely. Um, I can remember having a conversation with a psychologist, and I was talking about how we forecast and perceive the future. And he stopped me and he said, Peter, we imagine the future. He said, the future is inherently unknown. And what investors demonstrate over and over is that they create this very clear future. And sometimes it's dystopian, sometimes it's unicorns and rainbows. But where investors get in trouble is the degree to which they misimagine the future. And today, I think there's questions as to whether we are misimagining AI, which means we're misimagining the need for data centers, which means we're misimagining the need for electric energy. And so the question is, do we have this entourage trade where it's not just the future of AI that's being exaggerated, but it's taking along all these associated, picks and shovels companies, as it were, that we think will benefit forever from that. But I don't know. I mean, we will see this play out. But when I see companies like Microsoft and Amazon getting into the nuclear energy business, that says to me people are projecting far into the future this insatiable demand for power.
I just generally think, especially with investors, when people are too confident in a particular scenario, like just for example, in investing, we shouldn't be certain about what the outcome is going to be, right? We should be prepared for all different outcomes, and we should be hedged, and we should be a number of different things to prepare for all those different outcomes. When I see people that are extremely confident and say there's going to be a recession next year in February, and this stock is going to double in the next 6 months, that scares me off, because they shouldn't really. The future is uncertain.
This is an experiment I do with investors to say, what are the things that you are most certain of? And ask them, put probabilities around this. And then say, because the future is inherently uncertain, every action that you take has 50-50 odds. So look at your list at where you have assigned the greatest probabilities. That's on you, not the future. And so what you're expressing with your probabilities isn't the likelihood of the outcome, but the intensity of your imagination. And so these are the trades that you are most likely to be most wrong on. So size them appropriately. I say this a lot to investors. Plan for what you can imagine, but be prepared for what you can't. That when I think about whether it's investor decision making, corporate decision making, government decision making, where organizations and individuals fail is that they plan only for what they can imagine, and they have no preparation for what they can't. And often the cost of preparing for what you can't imagine is really cheap when the crowd agrees with you. So that the cost of taking the other side of the trade is pennies, because nobody believes that's probable. And one of the other ways I frame this is, imagine walking into your boss's office and suggesting that you want to back up the truck to go all in on something. When your boss agrees, you should never do it. When your boss tells you to get the hell out of his office and starts laughing at you and ridiculing you, that's the moment you do it. The most opportunistic trades should feel the most uncomfortable, not only to you, but to others. I love being laughed at. As a researcher, when the crowd laughs at an idea that I have, it's like, okay, we're getting close. This is the time to either get out or back up the truck.
What do they say? First they laugh at you, then they ignore you, that then you win, right?
Yeah, they our inability to imagine something happening is the best predictor of it occurring. I often say that about the recession. People say, what's the best leading indicator of a recession? It's our inability to imagine one.
I wanted to ask you about how governments can continue to provide confidence to consumers and people in their constituencies. I'm thinking, especially, we look at things like Fed policy, right? At the moment, they're in the process of decreasing interest rates. How do someone like the Fed, how do they portray confidence to consumers and to the market in order for them to effectively do their jobs?
So I have these thoughts on policymakers broadly. Policymakers react to the mood of the crowd. They are inherently crowd following. They do nothing to boost our confidence. We give them permission to boost our confidence. Confidence is self-determined. And so I can't boost your confidence. You can't boost my confidence. I have to conclude that I have certainty and control. If you go back and you look at policymaker actions, at lows in confidence, we don't think they'll work. We have no belief that they're powerful. To quote Jim Cramer, as he's shouting, they know nothing. We we think they're useless at lows in confidence. And at peaks in confidence, we attribute strength and power to them that they don't have. Our institutions are only as strong as we are. And I can see this in the way the Fed funds rate tracks the 90-day T-bill rate. They're catching up with us always. To think that a bureaucratic government committee can move as fast as the markets, I think, is inherently laughable. They never will. They will react at the extreme. And so, that said, we should remember that. And so when we see governments behaving impulsively and emotionally, what they're telling us is that our mood is reaching an extreme. And so it's a signal that we shouldn't ignore because it often coincides with major turning points in the financial markets.
Yeah. Yeah. I think with an agency like the Fed, I think there was not a lot of confidence in them when inflation was going up and when they started to say inflation was transitory and it turned out it wasn't, right? And then obviously they've done a reasonably good job at reducing inflation. So there's probably a little bit more confidence in the Fed now than there was 18, 24 months ago, right?
Yeah, I would just say that we did a really good job at curbing inflation, and they have just followed us in this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And please appreciate, I'm not being critical of them. I'm sympathetic to their plight, but I think the investor community, attributes a level of power to them that is unjustified. They follow us. That's the nature of all regulation, including monetary policy.
Okay. And as you're involved in confidence, I've got a bit of a off the wall question here. But as you're involved in looking more into confidence and building up more and more metrics in that particular area, how do you see the evolution of the study of confidence moving forward into the future? Do you think there will be, for example, confident metrics in real time? Will there be other types of innovation where people can study confidence more critically than they can right now?
Yeah, and I think I do. And I think we live in a really wonderful moment when there are real objective measures of confidence that can be used. I will often use Google Trends analysis because I know that if we feel it, we search it. And so Google Trends are wonderful. You know, to look at search data, that's telling me in real time how the crowd feels. So you'll see the intensity of searches for individuals, for specific words, for ticker symbols. They all do a wonderful job of measuring mood in real time and the intensity of it. And I know that there are a number of quant shops that have created interesting proxies for mood, that they've developed their own, weighted measures of different variables that have given them insights into moods. They're those that just look at, word choices on X, because those translate into market behavior shortly thereafter. So there's really cool stuff being done. Having said that, for most investors, you don't need all the quantitative research. What I try to do in my own work is to think of things in terms of a mosaic, and to think about what would an extreme in confidence look like in a company like Tesla. What kinds of behaviors should I expect to see from management, from customers, from suppliers to governments? And when I start to see those behaviors, then I know we're reaching an extreme. The mosaic is never going to be completely black or white, but you can start to see the tiles turning at these extremes. And what I encourage investors to do is to let your imagination run wild, to think about what would it look like when mood is high or when mood is low, and to file those notes away. Because in those moments when emotion is really high, which it tends to be at extremes in confidence, having this very objective list that you've come up with allows you to go, oh, we're here. And remember, when I created that list, I often refer to it as a bingo card. Just mark off the boxes. You'll start to see that, okay, I foresaw that things would look like this when confidence was high or confidence was low. We're we're there. And now is a time to begin to change my risk profile.
Yeah, there is a lot of telltale signs when companies are growing too big, and that there might be an imminent bubble forming in their company, or they might be ready for a downtrend. Especially like you see stuff, for example, like new employee announcements where they get lots of new employees and the market automatically thinks, well, they're growing, they're getting much larger, right? But when that starts to wade a little bit, then those companies become severely bloated, right? And that can be a telltale sign they were probably overconfident in employing people during the good times, and they didn't think so much about what might happen if there were some bad times.
Yeah, I look at it in a different light. When CEOs get fired, that typically when a CEO is fired, it's because the board has had enough, which means shareholders have had enough. And so it's just a measure of frustration, of powerlessness and uncertainty that that the board capitulates just like a retail investor does at the bottom.
Okay. All right. Excellent. That's a lot of good food for thought. Peter, I wanted to ask you as well is how can the audience find out a bit more about you? What social media do you have? How can people reach out?
Sure. So I'm on X at Peter underscore Atwater. I also frequently write about confidence in the context of current events on LinkedIn. I write a commentary for investors through Financial Insyghts, with insights spelled with a Y. Um, and there is my book, The Confidence Map, which really provides the framework and concepts behind the things that I've been saying today, why I believe what I believe.
Yeah. Well, I really recommend that people read that book. It's a very interesting read. And I think people will get a lot from our conversation today. Very interesting subject. Actually, I had about 500 more questions that I could have asked you. Could have gone on for a 5-hour podcast, but I think people might have stopped listening after that. So I'd love to invite you back another time for a round two on the questions.
I'd be happy to come back, Stephen. This is very fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks very much, Peter. I'll leave all the details in the description for everybody below to find out more about Peter. But thank you very much for coming on the show today and look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thanks very much.